Let us slip deeper into the texture of that vanished night. Forget the concept of bedtime as a single scheduled event. Instead, envision a gradual fading, a gentle dissolution of the self into the gathering shadows. The transition began not with an alarm set for the morning, but with the fading of the light, the world performing its own, ancient dimming ritual. As the last copper rim of the sun vanished, a profound psychological shift occurred. The day's script, with its list of visible, actionable tasks, was finished. A new, more interior script, written in the language of rest and restoration, began its slow unfurling. This first surrender was not to sleep, but to a state of profound psychological quiescence. The mind, no longer required to solve the external problems of field or forge, turned its gaze inward. In the flickering, uncertain light of a rush dip or banked fire, faces softened. Conversations, if they happened, drifted into lower registers, becoming less about planning and more about sharing, less about facts and more about feelings, the murmur of a story told for the 100th time, the quiet recounting of a small event. This was the mind's decompression chamber, a critical buffer zone between the bright noise of day and the silent depths of first sleep. It was here that the clutter of the day was gently cleared away, making space for the night's true work to begin. The architecture of their homes conspired to aid this descent. Low ceilings held in warmth. Small windows, shuttered against the dark and the cold, created a tangible sense of enclosure and safety. The very materials, rough minus hewn wood, stone, wattle and daub, seemed to exhale the cool, earthy scent of permanence and shelter. This was not just a room, it was a capsule, a protective shell against the vast, unknowable night outside. Within it, the small human circle drew closer, their shared breath and body heat creating a micro-climate of security. The psychology of this is immense. To feel physically contained, safe within a warm pocket against a cold universe, is the most fundamental prerequisite for the nervous system to stand down. Our modern bedrooms, often large, well-lit, and connected to the digital world, lack this primal, womb-like reassurance. Then came the first sleep, not as a choice, but as an inevitability. It was a dropping away, like a stone falling through deep, still water. This phase of sleep was so profound it was almost vegetative in its quality. Consciousness did not retreat, it was comprehensively dissolved. This was the body's sovereign domain. Here, at the cellular level, a silent, urgent congress was held. Resources were reallocated. The energy that had fueled the day's labor was now redirected inward, to the sites of minor injury and strain: the sore shoulder, the blistered hand, the tired back. Inflammatory responses were dampened. The immune system's sentinels patrolled and repaired. This was not passive rest, it was a state of intense, biological activism, all dedicated to physical preservation. To interrupt this process was seen as a kind of violence against the self, a theft of essential restoration. The waking that followed was a rebirth into a different kind of night. The world was utterly transformed. If the first sleep was a journey to the earth's core, this waking was floating to the surface of a calm, black sea. The silence was now an active presence, a thick velvet held against the ears. In this absolute quiet, the senses, deprived of their daytime work, became exquisitely sensitive. One could hear the scurrying of a mouse in the thatch with startling clarity, or discern the subtle shift in the wind outside. This hyper-minus awareness was not jarring but peaceful. The mind, wonderfully clear and unburdened by daytime chatter, was capable of a rare, crystalline form of thought. This nocturnal watch was where the internal landscape was tended. It was the hour of philosophy for the plowman, of theology for the housewife, of strategy for the artisan. Free from the distorting lens of social roles and immediate demands, people could converse with their own souls. They could examine a lingering guilt with compassion, turn over a hope for the future, or simply marvel at the intricate tapestry of a memory. For the creative, it was a time when melodies or poetic phrases might surface, unburdened from the deep. For the devout, it was a direct line to the divine, unimpeded by the cacophony of daily life. This period answered a deep human need for existential solitude, for a time when one was not a doer, but simply a B-minuser, contemplating the mystery of one's own existence under the watchful stars. The return to the second sleep was a yielding, not a struggle. Having been hurt and soothed, the mind was now willing to release its grip on consciousness once more. This second phase was the realm of narrative and symbol. If the first sleep healed the body, the second sleep organized the psyche. Dreams here were not fleeting images, but rich, episodic sagas. They processed emotional residues, rehearsed social scenarios, and wove the disparate threads of experience into a coherent inner story. This was where learning was cemented, where the skill of the day's craft was neurologically rehearsed and reinforced. Waking from this just before dawn, one did not merely feel less tired. One felt reconciled, the physical self repaired, the emotional self processed, the cognitive self ordered. Contrast this holistic renewal with the thin, brittle quality of much modern sleep. We often seek only the first sleep, the knockout blow of unconsciousness, while in eyeing ourselves the second and, crucially, the transformative watch in between. We use chemicals and gadgets to force the first plunge, but we miss the gentle, natural arc of the full cycle. We wake up with our bodies perhaps rested, but our minds still cluttered, our emotions unprocessed, feeling functionally restored but existentially fragmented. The lesson is in the pattern, not the particulars. We cannot recreate the strong mattress of the absolute darkness of a pre-minus electric world, but we can architect our evenings to mimic the psychological and physiological progression our biology still expects. We can create our own buffers, own an hour of low light, slow activity, and digital disconnection that serves as our modern hearth-minus side. We can reframe waking in the night not as insomnia to be battled, but as a potential watch to be accepted. Instead of reaching for a blinding phone, we might practice lying in the dark, listening to our breath, allowing the mind its nocturnal meanderings without judgment. We can learn to see sleep not as a monolithic block of time to be conquered, but as a nuanced cycle with different phases of value: deep physical restoration, conscious integration, and psychic storytelling. Ultimately, the medieval secret whispers that sleep is not a commodity to be efficiently managed, but a relationship to be cultivated. It is a relationship with our own primal rhythms, with the descent and quiet of evening, with the comforting darkness. It requires respect, patience, and a surrendering of control. We must provide the conditions, the psychological safety, the physical fatigue, the sensory calm, then trust the ancient, intelligent process to unfold. By weaving threads of their rhythm, the deliberate fade, the respect for the night's segmented gifts, the sanctity of the dark into the fabric of our lives, we do not mimic the past, as men tell a deep truth about human nature. We acknowledge that we are not machines to be switched off, but organisms designed to cycle through seasons of effort and seasons of rest, even within the compass of a single night. In this acknowledgement, and in the small, faithful practices that follow, we may once again find our way not just to sleep, but to the wholeness that true, natural rest bestows. Imagine the passage into the medieval evening not as an event, but as a slow collective exhalation. The world itself seemed to sigh. This was a twilight governed by profound inevitability, as there entered to forces that no candle flame could defy. The transition was total from the kingdom of sight to the realm of sound and touch and inner vision. Our contemporary minds, wired for perpetual engagement, had likely fracture in such a boundless quiet. For them, it was not an emptiness, but a fertile void. It was in this rich, dark soil that the seeds of a deeper consciousness were sown, and a form of sleep we can barely comprehend took root and flourished. Consider the very quality of their fatigue. It possessed a moral and physical clarity now almost extinct. Each ache in the shoulder was a ledger entry, a direct receipt for labor rendered. There was no ambiguity, no guilt of tasks half-minus finished in a digital ether. The body kept its own honest accounts, and the debt was paid in a currency of pure, unmediated rest. This fatigue did not buzz with anxious energy. It settled like a weight of warm stones, pulling the body down into a state of blessed gravity. Sleep was not an attempt to escape consciousness, but the earned and rightful conclusion to a day that had been fully inhabited. To resist it would have been as irrational as resisting hunger after a fast. The architecture of their darkness was a master craftsman of the mind, sculpted perception, in the utter absence of visual reference. The inner eye grew powerful. Memory became a lantern. In the night watch, one did not simply recall the day's events, one revisited them, turning them over like smooth stones in the hand, feeling their contours, understanding their weight. This tactile form of thinking, this mental feeling, allowed for a processing of experience that was deep, somatic, and holistic. Problems were not just solved analytically, they were felt through until a kind of bodily intuition, a gut knowing emerged. Silence, too, was a medium. It was not a lack of noise, but a presence that allowed the faintest interior whispers of conscience, of creativity, of connection to something larger to be heard. Their segmented rest was, in essence, a reconciliation of humanity's dual nature. Here both creature and creator, animal and angel, governed by biology yet yearning for meaning. The first sleep honored the creature, the sweating, striving, hungry animal that needed its physical shell meticulously restored. The watch honored the angel, the contemplative, prayerful, and relational self that sought purpose, connection, and narrative. The second sleep then wove these two strands together, integrating the physical and the metaphysical in the loom of dreams. This nightly cycle was a miniature pilgrimage, a journey from the outer world to the innermost sanctum and back again, undertaken every single night. It provided a daily rhythm of death and rebirth, of dissolution and dream-iness creation, which gave existential structure to a life that could otherwise feel brutish and short. We, in our illuminated age, suffer from a profound dislocation. We live in the mind's glare, but we have become strangers to the mind's shadowy, fertile depths. We medicate the creature's fatigue while starving the angel's need for silent reflection. We demand that our biology conform to a schedule of perpetual production, then wonder why it rebels with insomnia and malaise. Our nights are no longer a distinct state of being, but a dim, compromised version of our days. We have lost the art of the threshold, those rituals and acceptances that mark a passage from one mode of existence to another. To reclaim even a fragment of this lost wisdom requires a conscious rebellion against the tyranny of seamless light and continuous engagement. It asks us to reintroduce deliberate friction into the smooth, frictionless glide of the modern evening. This rebellion is quiet and personal. It might look like allowing the eyes to adjust to a room lit only by a single salt lamp, whose orange glow does not mimic the sun. It is the conscious decision to let the mind wander without a digital compass during a nighttime waking, to observe the parade of thoughts and images as one would watch clouds pass. It is the commitment to a daily physical expenditure so genuine that the body later pleads for the mattress, not just accepts it. The goal is not to replicate a historical sleep schedule down to the minute. It is to resurrect the underlying principles, the sanctity of darkness, as a biological command, the value of earned physical exhaustion, the necessity of a wind-down ritual that is psychological rather than just habitual, and the radical ray- framing of nighttime consciousness not as an enemy, but as a potential ally in our integration and well-being. In the end, the medieval knight offers us a poignant metaphor. They lived in a world where true darkness was inevitable, and they built a culture of rest within its confines. We live in a world where true darkness is elective, and we must now consciously choose to court it. We must choose to turn away from the false suns of our screens and face the creative, restorative power of the dark. We must learn again to listen to the ancient conversation between our creature-body and our angel-spirit. A conversation that happens most clearly not in the noisy daylight of doing, but in the quiet, segmented night of being. By making this choice, we do not step backward, we step more fully into our humanity, reclaiming a wholeness that has been flickering just beyond the reach of our electric light. We learn, once more, how to truly come to rest. To understand the profundity of their rest, we must first dismantle our own mythology of the night. I view darkness as a void to be filled, a canvas for our anxieties or our entertainments. For them, darkness was a medium dense, palpable, and brimming with potential. It was not an absence, but a different kind of presence. Into this medium, they released the accumulated tensions of daylight, not through analysis, but through a kind of osmotic surrender. The night did not ask them to think in its deepest phases. It asked them to cease thought entirely, to become pure, mending flesh. This was the first, and perhaps most forgotten, covenant of sleep. The architecture of their consciousness was fundamentally different. While modern minds are like vast, shallow pools, stirred constantly by incoming streams of information, reflection gleaming off every new ripple. Theirs were like deep wells, fed by a few steady sources: the land, the sky, the scripture, the hearth, the silt of the day, the argument with a neighbor, the stubborn patch of clay in the field would settle quickly in such depth. By nightfall, the waters of the mind, while not clear, were still. This stillness was the prerequisite for the night watch. It was not boredom, but a fertile calm in which the soul's own sediments, long minus buried hopes, latent fears, inarticulate joys, could slowly rise into view for examination. The quiet wake-up signals was not a time for problem minus solving, but for soul minus keeping. Consider, too, the phenomenology of their waking. There was no instantaneous, jarring shift from one reality to another. Dawn was not an alarm, but a gradual infusion. Light did not switch on its seat. It began as a mere lightening of the black to deep gray, a subtle thinning of the darkness at the window's edge. Then came the sounds, not the shriek of a buzzer, but the distant, tentative crow of a rooster, the stirring of livestock in the by-ray, the first crackle of rekindled fire. These were analog signals, rising in volume and frequency. The body was pulled from sleep by a chorus of natural cues, its own chemistry, the slow retreat of melatonin, the gentle rise of cortisol orchestrating the shift in perfect harmony with the external world. To awaken was to be gently gathered back into the fabric of life, stitch by slow stitch. The communal nature of their sleep also performed a hidden psychological function. In an age of radical physical vulnerability to disease, to famine, to the elements, the shared bed was a fortress of warmth and mutual protection. The syncopated breathing of family, the simple animal comfort of another's warmth against your back, signal to the most ancient parts of the brain, you are not alone, the tribe is here, the perimeter is guarded. This deep seated sense of safety, achieved through physical proximity, is something our isolated, temperature controlled bedrooms, for all their comfort, often fail to provide. Our solitude, prized as it is, can be neurologically interpreted as a state of heightened alert. Their togetherness whispered permission to the nervous system: stand down. All is well. We have, in our quest for efficiency, medicalized and mechanized sleep. We speak of sleep hygiene as if rest were a clinical procedure, and of sleep performance as if it were an athletic event. We track our cycles with cold blue light, turning the mysterious, sovereign process of restoration into a dataset to be optimized. The medieval approach was the antithesis of this. It was an act of faith, not of control. One prepared the conditions, the honest labor, the evening calm, the surrender to darken, then entrusted oneself to a process as natural and unquestioned as digestion or the change of seasons. Sleep was not a project of the self, it was something that happened to the self, a gift bestowed by the world's rhythm when one lived in alignment with it. Therefore, the invitation from their world is not prescriptive, but philosophical. It asks us, what are the true conditions for surrender? How do we build a mode of quiet between our day-selves and our night-selves? Can we rediscover a form of fatigue that is earned, rather than merely endured? The path does not lie in mimicking their actions, but in understanding the principles those actions served. We must become curators of our own desk. This means actively cultivating a poverty of stimulation as evening falls, a deliberate divestment from the blinding currency of information. It means sensitizing ourselves to natural cues, perhaps by letting the natural fade of outdoor light dictate our dimming of indoor lights. It means reframing physical activity not as a means to an aesthetic end, as a way to accrue the kind of tangible, bodily debt that demands deep repayment. And perhaps most challenging lie, it means evaluating our relationship with solitude and shared space, seeking forms of evening communion, a shared meal without screens, a quiet conversation in low light that replicate that ancient, neural signal of tribal safety. Their gift to us is the image of sleep as an ecosystem, not a transaction. It thrives on specific conditions, darkness as a positive force, fatigue as an honest wage, silence as a nourishing medium, and safety as a felt, physical reality. We have spent centuries engineering these conditions out of our lives in the name of progress and convenience. Now, we find ourselves in a barren landscape of restless nights, yearning for a richness we have forgotten how to grow. The work, then, is one of restoration. He must frame us wild our night. We must reintroduce the darkness, the quiet, the natural rhythm, not as hardships, but as the essential nutrients they are for the human spirit. We must allow the seamless, artificial data fracture to make room for the ancient, segmented rhythm that still hums in our blood. In doing so, we may find that the most profound progress is not forward into more lightened noise, but backward or perhaps inward into a deeper, older, and more restorative kind of dark. The deepest secret of the medieval night was not in its silence, nor in its division, but in its profound acceptance of human incompleteness. We moderns approach sleep as a demand for total restoration, a desperate bargain struck with the unconscious make me whole again by morning. They understood, implicitly, that wholeness is not a nightly deliverance, but a continuous negotiation between fracture and mending. Their segmented rhythm was a masterful acknowledgement of this truth. The first sleep administered a blunt, physiological repair, a stitching of the flesh. The wakeful watch provided a space for the psyche to acknowledge its rents and seams, to feel the edges of its wounds without panic. The second sleep then offered not a final cure, but a delicate, narrative binding a dream-story to hold the pieces together until the next night's work could continue. Pest was not a full reset, but a compassionate, ongoing maintenance of a fragile vessel. Their relationship with time itself fostered this acceptance. Time was not a linear track to be raced down, but a cyclical field to be inhabited. The night was not lost time subtracted from productivity, it was a different dimension of time altogether, one devoted to a slower, more essential form of work. Just as the field lay fallow to regenerate, so too did the human mind and body require this fallow period of darkness. This cyclical view removed the frantic urgency we attached to sleep. There was no pressure to perform rest efficiently because rest was not in competition with wakefulness, it was its necessary partner in a perpetual, cosmic dance. Tomorrow would come, and with it, more labor and more fracture, but also, inevitably, the next fallow period of mending. This certainly bred a patience with the process that we have utterly lost. We must also confront the role of belief. For the medieval mind, the night was porous to other worlds. It was not an inert pause, but a thinning of the veil. This was not mere superstition, it was a powerful cognitive framework. To believe that angels, spirits, or the divine moved more freely in the dark was to believe that the night-watch was shared. One's quiet ruminations were a form of communion. One's dreams were potential messages. This imbued the nocturnal hours with sacred significance and profound meaning. Insomnia in such a framework could be reinterpreted not as a malfunction, but as an invitation a call to prayer, to vigilance, to receiving. Our secular, mechanistic model strips the night of this meaning, leaving only a biological function to be optimized. When that function fails, we are left with nothing but frustration and a sense of personal inadequacy. They, in their wake of silence, could still feel connected to a larger, meaningful order. We in ours often feel only alone with our malfunctioning brain chemistry. The sensory palette of their pre-sleep world was a gentle sedative in itself. Consider the textures ruffle blankets, the give of a straw tick, the smooth worn wood of a bed frame, the smells wood smoke, tallow, the faint, musty scent of earth rising from a packed-dirt floor, the sounds the wind in the thatch, a settling of timber, the soft, rhythmic breath of others. This was a sensory environment of profound consistency and soft repetitive input, was the opposite of the high-contrast, rapidly shifting sensory barrage that precedes modern sleep, the flickering blue light, the ping of notifications, the jarring cuts of streaming video. Their environment gently sanded down the sharp edges of consciousness ours hammers at it, creating more fractures than sleep can possibly mend. So what is the transformative insight for us? It is that we must stop trying to solve sleep and start trying to inhabit the night as a distinct state of being. This requires a philosophical and sensory revolution. First, we must cultivate a theology of the night, even if it is a secular one. We must assign value and meaning to the dark hours beyond mere utility. This could be a time for an instrumental reflection, for gentle creativity without a goal, for mindful connection with a partner. We must see the night as a sanctuary for the parts of ourselves that are inefficient, unproductive, and mysterious. Second, we must redesign our prelude to sleep as a sensory migration. We must move deliberately from the hard, bright, fast world of the day into a soft, dim, slow world of our own creation. This is about curating an environment of gentle monotony, the repetitive brush of breath, the soft drone of a fan or white noise, a modern proxy for the wind in the thatch, the dim warmth of an on-blue light. It is a deliberate dulling of the senses to coax the mind into letting go. Finally, we must learn the art of the compassionate watch. When we wake, as we inevitably will, we can practice meeting that wakefulness not with a groan of resistance, but with a curious, almost hospitable acceptance. We can lie still and observe the internal landscape without rushing to fix it or flee from it. In this space, we might find, as they did, that some of our most essential mending happens not in unconsciousness, but in a quiet, conscious adjacency to it. Their legacy is not a sleep schedule, but a worldview, one that saw the human being as a creature of rhythm, fracture, and meaning, whose restoration required not just darkness, but a sacred respect for the dark's unique purpose. To reclaim our sleep, we must first reclaim our night, not as a failed day, but as a different country altogether, with its own landscapes, its own logic, and its own necessary, reparative work. We must cross the border each evening with intention, leaving behind the day's currency of achievement, and learn once more to breathe the different air of that other, outer world. Let us consider the medieval night not as a historical fact, but as a state of consciousness, a territory of being we have largely vacated. We have colonized the darkness with light, turning a foreign realm into a dim suburb of our endless day. But they were fluent in its language. Their sleep was not an isolated act of biology, it was the concluding movement in a daily symphony composed by necessity, ritual, and the unwavering facts of the physical world. To understand their rest is to understand a life lived in profound dialogue with limitation, a dialogue that paradoxically cultivated a profound inner freedom. The framework of their existence was built upon inescapable contrasts: fire against cold, light against utter dark, cacophonous labor against deep silence. These were not inconveniences, but defining polarities that gave shape to experience. The body, subjected to the day's abrasive friction, craved the smoothing balm of the night. The mind, filled the tangible, coarse demands of survival, was granted the velvety space for intangible reflection. Sleep, in this context, was the ultimate act of balancing these opposites. The first sleep was the body's plunge into the cool, neutralizing antidote to the day's heat and strain. The wakeful interval was the mind's graceful arc from the concrete to the abstract. The second sleep was the integration, where the abstract in the form of dreams was woven back into the fabric of the somatic self. Their wholeness was not a default state, but an achievement turned nightly through this ritual of reconciliation. Consider the psychological impact of living without expectation of interruption. After true sunset, no message could arrive. No news, good or ill, could penetrate the dark. This created a psychological container of absolute integrity. The concerns of the night were only the concerns already present within the walls, within the self. This enforced a radical present-mindedness. One dealt with what was here: the cooling air, the sleeping child, the faint scent of yesterday's bread, the texture of one's own thoughts. This present-mindedness was a form of cognitive shelter. Anxiety, as we know it, is often the mind's frantic travel through hypothetical futures or regretted pasts. Their night, by its very nature, anchored the mind firmly in the tangible sensate now. And a mind anchored in the present is a mind prepared for rest, not because it is empty, but because it is fully, simply, occupied with what is. Their physicality was also a form of knowing. Knowledge was not merely cerebral, It was stored in the calloused hands that knew the exact pull of a wet clay, in the back that remembered the weight of a full sheaf, in the legs that knew the distance to the far field. At night, this bodily knowledge did not vanish, it settled. During the watch, the somatic intelligence could commune with the more discursive mind. The plowman, in his quiet, might not think about the field, but might feel a kind of echo of its resistance in his palms, a memory that was less thought than felt resonance. This integration of body minus mind was a silent, nightly conversation that kept the self coherent. Our disconnect from sustained physical labor severs this line of communication, leaving the mind to chatter alone in a void, ungrunted by the body's deep, wordless wisdom. Therefore, our path forward is not one of imitation, but of translation. We must translate the core principles of that existence into a lexicon our modern nervous system can comprehend. We must engineer our own inescapable contrasts. This means creating a true sensory and psychological demarcation between the kingdoms of day and night. The transition must be a ritual of subtraction and softening. It might involve a physical gesture as simple as lighting a single candle while powering down every screen, visually enacting the surrender to a softer, more vulnerable light source. It could mean changing into clothing reserved only for sleep, a tactile signal to the skin that its public duty is done. We must cultivate a new form of necessary labor. For us, this cannot be tilling soil, but it must be something that genuinely spends the body's capital and accumulates that honest debt of fatigue. It must be strenuous, focused, and conclusive in activity with a clear end point that the body can register as completion. This creates the legitimate thirst for rest, and we must practice a radical present-mindedness in our evenings. This is the deliberate cultivation of a low minus stakes, immediate awareness, the taste of tea, the feel of a book's pages, the sound of our own breath, the quality of the dim light on a wall. This practice gently corrals the mind from its time, minus traveling anxieties, and pins it, softly but firmly, in the sensory reality of the pre-minus sleep hour. It builds the cognitive shelter. Ultimately, the medieval model shows us that superb sleep is the byproduct of a life structured around rhythmic contrast and respectful limitation. We have devoted ourselves to the eradication of limitation, of darkness, of silence, of physical exhaustion, of boredom. Yet in doing so, we have eroded the very conditions that make deep, restorative rest not just possible but inevitable. The invitation is to become architects of benevolent constraint, to design pockets of enforced darkness, islands of guaranteed silence, periods of deliberate physical expenditure, and spans of time immune to digital intrusion. Within these constraints, a forgotten kind of freedom flourishes, the freedom of the mind to drift without agenda, of the body to repair without interruption, of the self to simply be without having to become. In rebuilding these gentle fences around our nights, we do not confine ourselves, but create the sacred enclosure where true restoration can, at long last, take root and grow. To truly grasp the essence of medieval sleep, we must envision it not as a passive state, but as a cultivated terrain landscape the soul navigated between sunset and dawn. Our modern conception is flat, a single plane of unconsciousness we try to occupy for a prescribed duration. Theirs was topographic, with distinct valleys of oblivion, plateaus of lucid calm, and ridges of visionary dreams. This journey through the night's interior geography was as vital to their sense of self as the day's journey across the external landscape of field and forest. The foundation of this terrain was an intimacy with natural law that bordered on kinship. The human organism was not seen as separate from the environment, but as a responsive instrument within it. The cooling air of evening was not just a weather condition, it was a biological cue, a cooling of the inner furnace that prepared the body for its restorative shutdown. The lengthening shadows were not merely optical effects, they were signals that pulled at the eyelids. This integration meant there was no conflict between personal desire and environmental demand. To sleep when darkness fell was not obedience to a rule, but a harmonious resonance, like a string ceasing to vibrate when the hand is lifted. Friction we experience wanting to sleep, but feeling awake was largely foreign. The rest was an alignment, a settling into a pre-minus existing groove worn deep by millennia. Within this alignment, The segmented structure served as a sophisticated emotional and cognitive ecosystem. The first sleep functioned as a profound detoxification not merely of physical metabolites, but of the day's emotional toxins, flashes of anger, sparks of envy, the grit of petty frustrations. These were purged in the forge of slow-wave sleep, burned away in the metabolic fires of pure physical restoration. The waking interval was the clear, still pool that remained after the sediment had settled. Here, the clearer waters of the spirit could be seen more enduring loves, bedrock anxieties, foundational hopes. This was the time for what we might now call integrative thinking, where events were not just remembered, but metabolized into the ongoing narrative of a life. The second sleep then allowed this refined material to be symbolically encoded, transforming lived experience into the mythic language of dreams, where lessons could be stored not as facts, but as felt truths and archetypal stories. We, in a hyper-minus cognitive era, attempt to solve the problem of sleep from the outside in. We applied ecology, chemistry, and behavioral hacks to a system designed to function from the inside out. The medieval approach was the inverse. They focused on curating the inputs to the system, the quality of the day's labor, the sanctity of the evening's calm, the totality of the dark, and then trusted the innate intelligence of the organism to produce the desired output, restorative rest. Their sleep technology was their culture, their daily rhythm, their built environment. It was all preemptive, woven seamlessly into the fabric of living, not applied as a corrective at the end of a dysregulated day. Thus, our task is not to adopt their pattern, but to reverse-minus engineer their principles into a modern ecology of rest. This requires a shift from managing symptoms to cultivating foundations. We must renegotiate our relationship with natural cues. This can begin with humble acts, leaving curtains open to allow the fading dust to wash the room, or using sunrise-minus simulating alarm clocks that recreate the gentle chromatic dawn. It means respecting the body's thermogemetry needs, allowing ourselves to cool in the evening, perhaps through a light blanket in a cool room, rather than overriding this signal with constant, uniform climate control. We must design our own cognitive topography for the night. This involves consciously creating the plateaus and valleys. The pre-minus sleep ritual becomes the gentle ascent to the first plateau, a time of dim lightened, non-minus stimulating activity. Accepting a nighttime waking becomes an opportunity to rest on that plateau, to practice a watchful, non-minus striving calm. The return to sleep is then the descent into the next valley of dreams. Reframing the night in this spatial, almost geographical way, removes the linear pressure of getting back to sleep and replaces it with a more patient exploration of the terrain itself. Most importantly, we must reclaim the night as a time for a different order of knowledge. The days for explicit, focal knowledge, solving problems, analyzing data, navigating social codes. The medieval night, particularly the watch, was for tacit, somatic, and intuitive knowing, the kind that arises from stillness, from felt sense, from dream logic. We can foster this by dedicating a few evening minutes to practices that engage this faculty: free journaling without purpose, mindful meditation focusing on bodily sensations, or simply sitting in darkness listening to the subtle inner sounds of memory and imagination. This validates the night as a time for a legitimate and vital form of intelligence that our daily world neglects. The profound lesson whispered from those centuries is that sleep is not a salvage operation for a spent day. It is the counterpart to wake-up signals, a necessary phase in a continuous cycle of engagement and disengagement, expression and reflection, expenditure and integration. By treating it merely as a pit stop for recovery, we miss its greater purpose to be the darkroom where the negatives of our daily experience are developed into the lasting prints of memory, meaning, and self. To honor sleep is to honor this full cycle. It is to build a life where the day is lived with enough presence and vigor to develop a rich negative, and where the night is preserved as the sacred, unhurried space necessary for its development. In this balanced rhythm, we find not just rest, but coherence. Not just recovery, but a quiet, ongoing revelation of who we are. The medieval night offered a final, profound lesson: the embrace of discontinuity. Our modern ideal is one of seamless continuity, a smooth, unbroken line from productive wake of cycles into managed sleep and back again. We pathologize the gap, the break, the waking moment in the dark. But their rhythm was one of sanctioned discontinuity. The night was not a continuation of the day in a dimmer key, it was a legitimate cessation, a deliberate and meaningful pause in the very fabric of being. This acceptance of pause permeated existence. Winter was not a failed summer, but a necessary cessation of growth. The Sabbath was not a day for different work, but for the sacred work of rest. And within the night, the watch was not a failure of sleep, but a micro-minus Sabbath, a holy interval of conscious inactivity. This cultural and spiritual framework made the fractured nature of human rest not just normal but sanctified. To wake in the night was to enter a chapel of time, a small, private liturgy of silence, was a built-minus and reminder that consciousness itself is not a steady flame, but a flickering one, and that its temporary dimming or shifting light is part of its natural, even sacred, function. Our physical reality enforced a humility that is anathema to our hybristic age. The body was not a programmable machine, but a finite vessel subject to incontrovertible laws of fatigue and repair. One could not decide to override these laws with willpower or stimulants. This humility was liberating. It absolved the individual of the responsibility to perpetually generate energy. Exhaustion was not a character flaw, but a faithful report from the frontiers of one's capacity. Sleep, therefore, was not a sign of weakness, but an act of wisdom, a heeding of the body's truthful testimony. In surrendering to it, one was not failing to persevere, one was aligning with a deeper, more ancient perseverance written into the flesh itself. Our contemporary crisis of rest stems from a rebellion against this very humility. We view the body's need for pause as a design flaw to be hacked, a limit to be overcome. We see discontinuity as inefficiency. We have constructed a world that flatters us with the illusion of infinite continuity of light, of information, of availability. But the human organism did not evolve for this. Our biology remains an echo of that older, discontinuous world. The insomnia, anxiety, and fatigue we experience are in part the protest of a system built for rhythmic interruption, forced to operate on a monotonous, unending hum. Therefore, the path to reclaiming rest is counterintuitively not through better techniques for seamless sleep, but through a philosophical and practical rehabilitation of discontinuity. He must learn to insert purposeful pauses, to welcome breaks, and to sanctify intervals of non-minus achievement. We must architect micro-minus Sabbaths throughout our evening and night. This could be a 10-minute period of sitting in absolute darkness before bed, a practice of non-minus doing the honors the coming discontinuity. It is a deliberate planting of a flag in the territory of pause. When we wake at night, we can practice a radical non-minus reaction. Instead of mentally reaching for the glue to fix the broken line of sleep, we can simply observe the gap. We can think, here is the watch. Here is the interval. This simple reframe from I have a sleep maintenance problem to I'm experiencing the natural biphasic rhythm transforms a source of anxiety into an experience of anthropological curiosity, even peace. We must also restore the dignity of our limits. This means engaging in activities that honestly reveal our finitude, physical exertion that leaves us truly spent, deep focus that exhausts our cognitive reserves, and then, crucially, honoring the report those limits give us. It means listening to the honest fatigue and responding not with stimulants to override it, but with respect that schedules its repayment. Ultimately, the medieval model illuminates a profound truth: our wholeness is not found in a relentless continuity of consciousness, but in the graceful rhythm of its engagement and release. The night, with its inherent pauses and phases, was not a subtraction from life, but a vital part of life's full expression. By learning to embrace the discontinuity, to see the space between our thoughts, the gap between our sleep cycles, the pause between our labors, not as emptiness to be feared, but as fertile silence to be inhabited, we do more than improve our sleep. We realign ourselves with a deeper pulse of existence. We exchange the exhausting project of maintaining a false continuity for the profound relief of surrendering to a natural, restorative rhythm. In that surrender, we may find not just better rest, but a more authentic and resilient form of being. The true genius of the medieval night was its understanding of rest not as a single state, but as a spectrum of consciousness. We have compressed the spectrum into a binary awake or asleep. For them, there existed a rich gradient in between a penumbral's own where the mind was neither fully engaged with the day nor fully surrendered to dreams. This was the habitat of the watch. A liminal space is crucial to their psychological ecology as wetlands are to a physical landscape. It was in this fertile marsh, between solid states, that essential processes of emotional filtration and spiritual germination occurred. This spectrum was mirrored in the very quality of their light. The day offered the stark, defining light of the sun, perfect for the clear minus-edged work of labor. Evening brought the mutable, ambiguous light of the hearth and tallow, a light that danced, that cast long, merging shadows, that's often definitions. This graduated dimming was a sensory curriculum teaching the mind to release its grip on certainty and precision. It was a physiological primer for the release of consciousness itself. Our modern transition is an abruption from the hyper-defined pixels of a screen to total darkness, with no pedagogical twilight to guide the way. We ask the mind to switch from a state of high-definition engagement to total nullity in an instant, and wonder at its resistance. Their relationship with sound followed a similar gradient. The day was filled with the distinct, purposeful sounds of labor, the clang of metal, the chop of wood, the calls of coordination. The night brought the ambient, non-purposeful soundscape, the wind's sigh, the crackle of fuel breaking down into ash, the distant, generalized rustle of nature. This shift from specific, actionable sounds to generalized, environmental noise further signaled the brain to move from a problem-solving mode to a receptive, ambient awareness. Our nates, by contrast, are often punctuated by the specific, intrusive sounds of technology, the ping of a delayed notification, a hum of electronic sounds that belong to the day's world of tasks and demands, thus holding the mind in the wrong kind of alertness. To integrate their wisdom, then, we must become designers of gradients. Our goal should not be to crash into sleep, but to slope gently into it. We must architect a sensory ramp for our evenings. This involves a deliberate, stepwise reduction in both the quality and quantity of sensory input. It could begin an hour before bed with the shift from bright, blue-spectrum light to warmer, dimmer lamps. It could involve transitioning from complex, narrative media fast-paced shows, intense reading to more repetitive, narrative sensory experiences, listening to simple, cyclical music, knitting, or even watching the slow, mesmerizing dance of a real flame. The key is to move down the spectrum from high-information stimuli to low-information, rhythmic ones. We must also rehabilitate the value of the penumbral's own itself. When we find ourselves awake in the night, we can consciously choose to inhabit this gradient state. Instead of turning on a bright light or reaching for a stimulating device, we might practice a form of open awareness in the dark. We can notice the weight of the blankets, the sound of our own heartbeat, the faint play of distant light through a curtain. This is not an attempt to fall asleep, but a conscious residency in the watchful, restorative state that exists between wakefulness and sleep. By honoring this state as valid and valuable, we remove the anxiety of not sleeping and often find that sleep then reclaims us more naturally. Finally, we must reconsider the very purpose we assign to the night. For the medieval world, the night was for integration, for prayer, for the intangible work of the soul. For the modern world, it is often merely storage space for insufficient daytime hours, a time to cram in entertainment or finish leftover work. We must actively assign a sacred, non-utilitarian purpose to the nighttime hours. This could be a personal commitment. The night is for gentle reflection, for gratitude journaling, for silent connection with a partner, for listening to the rain. By giving the night a positive identity beyond the time I'm unconscious, we change our relationship to its every phase, including sleep. In the end, the medieval secret asks us to expand our definition of rest. Rest is not merely the oblivion of sleep. It is the entire spectrum of softer consciousness, the quiet camaraderie of a fading evening, the profound peace of the watchful dark, the symbolic journey of dreams, and the deep, cellular restoration of unconscious slumber. By cultivating all these phases, by designing our lives to include the gradients, to honor the liminal spaces, and to sanctify the penumbral hours, we stop fighting a narrow battle for unconsciousness. We instead cultivate a rich and restorative relationship the entire night. We learn, as they did, that to rest fully is not to disappear from oneself, but to travel through the varied and necessary landscapes of one's own inner world. The ultimate revelation of the medieval sleep paradigm is its redefinition of time's architecture. We perceive time as linear, a resource to be segmented, allocated, and spent. Sleep, in this view, is a necessary deduction from the ledger of productive hours. Their experience was of time as layered, with the night constituting a parallel dimension that operated under different laws. The day was the realm of chronos, sequential, measurable, quantitative time. The night was the domain of kairos, the qualitative, opportune, and meaningful moment. The watch, that quiet eye in the storm of sleep, was the purest encounter with kairos and measured time, pregnant with reflection, presence, and a different order of thought. This layered experience of time granted a profound psychological resilience. The hardships of the day, the backbreaking labor, the social tensions, the ever-present specter of scarcity were endured within the vessel of Chronos. They had a beginning and, crucially, an end signaled by sunset. The processing of those hardships, the alchemy that transformed dry experience into endurance or wisdom, occurred in the separate vessel of Kairos, the nocturnal time. The day's events were deposited at the gate of evening, the night's quiet work converted them into the sustenance of the spirit. This meant no single day's trauma had to be fully absorbed within its own frantic frame. It could be deferred to the slower, more capacious time of night for digestion. Our modern collapse of these layers, bringing the day's unresolved anxieties and digital burdens directly into the bedroom, overwhelms the system. We attempt to process Chronos within Chronos, leaving no sacred space for Kairos to perform its healing work. Their environment was a conspirator in this temporal layering. The material world itself enforced the shift. As light failed, most tools became useless. Written words vanished from sight. The world of detailed manipulation literally slipped from their grasp, forcing a transition from active handling to passive receiving. The cold demanded stillness. The dark dissolved visual boundaries, turning attention inward. The night was not just a period on a clock, it was a physically enforced state of receptive being. Our environment now conspires against this shift. Our tools remain potent in the dark. Information is more accessible at midnight than it was at noon for a medieval scholar. The environment no longer forces a change of state. We must now choose it against a world designed for continuity. Therefore, our emulation must be both philosophical and fiercely practical. We must become temporal architects, deliberately constructing a Kairos dimension within our 24- our Chronos cycle. This begins with a ritual of temporal closure for the day. We must institute a symbolic end of business that is more than finishing tasks. It could be a physical act, closing a laptop and covering it with a cloth, silencing a phone and placing it in a drawer, literally putting the tools of Chronos to bed. This act declares that the time of measurable achievement is concluded. The remainder of the evening belongs to a different kind of time. We must then design an environment that enforces receptivity. This means creating a technological austerity in the sleeping space that mimics the positive limitations of the pre-Minus industrial night. It is the deliberate introduction of friction, using an old-fashioned alarm clock to remove the smartphone's temptation, employing light bulbs that can only dim to a warm amber, not provide full daylight for reading. The goal is to make the activities of Chronos checking, calculating, working physically awkward or impossible, thereby shepherding the mind toward the receptive state of Kairos. Most critically, we must practice the art of kairotic thinking in the evening and during night waking. This is thinking devoid of productivity. It is meandering reflection, sensory immersion, free-minded association, gratitude, or wonder. It is asking open, unanswerable questions rather than solving puzzles. It might involve simply listening to a piece of music with total absorption, or recalling a memory and vivid sensory detail without judgment. This strengthens the mind's ability to inhabit the qualitative time of night, making the watch a place of richness rather than anxiety. The medieval model shows us that human flourishing requires not just sleep, but access to this other kind of time. The relentless linearity of modern life is a form of temporal poverty. By rebuilding a sanctuary for Kairos within our nights through ritual, environmental design, and mental practice, we address a deficit more profound than sleep deprivation. We address a starvation of meaning, a lack of space for the soul to reconcile itself with the life it is living. In restoring the layered night, we do not just recover rest. We recover a vital dimension of our humanity, learning once more to dwell not only in the ticking of the clock, but in the deep, silent, and restorative well of time that stands apart from it. The final, and perhaps most profound, wisdom embedded within the medieval knight is the concept of surrender as an act of skill. He approached sleep as a target, a state to be captured through effort and control. They understood it as a harbor to be reached by lowering the sails and allowing the prevailing currents to carry them. Their entire lifestyle was a meticulous preparation for this surrender, a crafting of the vessel body and mind so that it might drift effortlessly into the deep waters of rest when the moment came. This mastery of surrender was built upon a foundation of irreversibility. When night fell, most actions became final. The fire, once banked, could not be instantly flared. The path beyond the door was swallowed by an impenetrable dark. This irreversibility bred a profound acceptance. Once the decision to retire was made, there was no latent anxiety about unfinished business, because finishing it was physically impossible until dawn. The mind, confronted with this absolute boundary, could truly relinquish its grip. Our modern curse is reversibility. A thought can be acted upon instantly. A work email can be answered from bed. The boundary is porous, and so the mind remains on duty, its clutch never fully disengaged, perpetually in a low-grade state of readiness that sabotaged deep surrender. Their surrender was also ecological. It was not an individual struggle in a silent room, but assisting with a larger, sleeping system. The household slept, the village slept, the fields slept, the wild animals sought their dens. To stay wakeful was to be out of phase with the entire world. This external consensus provided a powerful social reinforcement for the internal release. Our society offers no such consensus. Someone is always awake, working, playing, streaming. To choose sleep can feel like opting out, a personal failure to keep pace, making surrender feel less like harmony and more like defeat. Thus, our modern challenge is to cultivate the art of active surrender in a world engineered to prevent it. We must build our own irreversibility and seek out new forms of consensus. We must engineer personal points of irreversibility. This means creating definitive, symbolic acts that mark the crossable border between day and night. It could be a physical key turning in a lock, even if metaphorical, a dedicated sleep tea whose ritual preparation signals the end of decision-making, the placement of a notebook by the bed with the explicit rule that any urgent thought can be written down and released until morning. The act itself is less important than its unwavering finality. It tells the brain, the bridge is drawn up. Further engagement is not an option. We must forge a new consensus, even if it is a micro-consensus within our own homes or partnerships. This is the communal agreement that after a certain hour, the environment shifts into harbor mode. Lights dim to a preset level, devices enter a central charging station, voices lower. This creates a shared, external reinforcement for the internal wind down. For those living alone, this can be a consensus with one's future self, a promised and non-negotiable treaty with the coming night. Finally, we must reframe surrender not as passivity, but as a courageous and skilled act of trust. It is the trust that the world, and our own responsibilities, can persist for a few hours without our vigilant management. It is the trust in the body's ancient, self-healing intelligence. Practicing this trust might involve a brief meditation before sleep where one consciously hands over the cares of the day to the universe, to one's subconscious, to a higher power in a deliberate act of mental relinquishment. The medieval secret, in its entirety, illuminates sleep as the pinnacle of a life lived in intelligent harmony with natural law. It was the graceful culmination of a day spent in purposeful exertion, concluded by an evening of deliberate calming, undertaken within a world that honored the dark. We cannot return to their world, but we can resurrect the principles that made their rest so profound: the sanctity of rhythm, the necessity of contrast, the value of the liminal, the architecture of layered time, and the skilled practice of active surrender. By integrating these principles, we move beyond hacking sleep. We begin to cultivate a form of wakefulness so fully and honestly lived that it naturally compels the corresponding depth of rest. We stop trying to conquer the night and learn instead to be its gracious guest, accepting its unique hospitality, the deep repair, the quiet clarity, the symbolic dreams as gifts offered only when we arrive at its threshold prepared, weary, and ready to truly let go. In that letting go, we find not just rest, but a reunion with a more ancient, more resilient, and more peaceful version of ourselves.